Romans 8:29, more thoroughly explained. When most readers meet Romans 8:29, they read it in a translation that uses the word predestined. For many, that English word arrives already loaded with a system, as if Paul were saying, those God selected before time, he locked into a guaranteed outcome. Before any careful reading begins, a whole metaphysical structure is already humming in the background. The question in view here is much simpler and much more basic. If we strip away later systems and simply take Paul's Greek sentence on its own terms, what did he actually say? And what kind of action did he actually describe? The line can be paraphrased like this. Those he knew previously, he set within a predefined framework so that they would be influenced by that framework to be conformed to the image of Christ. This is not a clever reinterpretation, but a faithful unpacking of the Greek grammar and of the immediate context of Romans 8. To see that, we need to work through the sentence from the inside, paying attention to who is doing what to whom, and what Paul has already been saying in the chapter about how God actually works with people. Paul writes in Greek, Hoti haus proegno, kai prorisen sumorphus, tes eikonos, tu huio auto. A very wooden rendering would sound something like, because those whom he knew beforehand, he also preset as sharing the form of the image of his Son. That is not polished English, but it gets the main pieces on the table. There is a set of people, those whom. God is the subject. He knew beforehand that group. Then he preset them as sumorphous, people sharing a certain morph, a certain form, namely the form of the image of his Son. The first expression in the paraphrase, those he knew previously, corresponds to haus proenio. Grammatically, haus, those whom, is the direct object, and it carries over both verbs. The same people are known beforehand and preset. The verb proegno is the aorist of progenosko, a compound of genosko, to know, with the prefix pro, before. The most straightforward sense is temporal. To know before, to know in advance. In Paul, though, knowing is often more than bare awareness. To know someone can mean to acknowledge, to recognize with favor, to enter into relation with them. So those he knew previously means more than those whose data he stored in advance. It suggests those he had regard for, those he took notice of, those who were already within his relational horizon. The temporal element is still there. The pro in proegno is not decorative. Paul is describing a sequence. God's knowing comes first, and the further actions he describes build on that prior regard. The wording, those he knew previously, preserves this simple time relation without importing a whole metaphysical picture of before the universe into the verb itself. It keeps us with the text. There is a before, and the before has to do with knowing, not with an entire list of fixed events. The next phrase in the paraphrase is the most important. He set within a predefined framework. This seeks to render the combination kai prorisen sumorphus tes eikonos to huiou. The verb prorisen is the aorist of prorizo, another pro-compound. The base verb horizo means to set a boundary, to define, to mark off. When pro is added, the sense becomes to set in advance, to define beforehand, to mark out ahead of time. That basic sense is well attested in ordinary Greek usage. The verb is used for pre-assigning roles, setting protocols, setting a wedding date. None of that by itself carries the idea that every later action inside that boundary is causally forced. The stress falls on scope and parameters decided ahead of time. In Romans 8:29, Proorison governs the same object as proegno. God is acting on those whom he already knew. The complement samorphos is a predicate accusative. That means it is not a second, different object, but a description of what those people are preset as. They are preset as sumorphoi, sharing the form, having the same form. The following genitive, tes ekonos to huiou auto, tells us which form is in view, that of the image of his son. If we push the literal rendering as far as English will bear, we get something like, he also preset them as people sharing the form of the image of his son. That is what set within a predefined framework is doing in more contemporary language. The framework in this wording is not some extra concept brought in from outside. It is a way of describing what a morphe or icon does, especially in a moral and communal context. A Christ image pattern is a kind of framework. It is a pre-specified pattern of life, character, and relationship within which people are meant to live and grow. It is important to notice what Paul says and what he does not say. He does not say, those he knew previously. He caused irresistibly to become conformed. He does not say, those he knew previously. He made it metaphysically impossible that they should end up other than conformed. The verb proorizo points to a decision about boundaries and status made beforehand. The predicate accusative samorphos indicates the shape of that status. Together they describe what God has established in advance as the pattern in which these people are to stand. The language of a predefined framework catches that quite well. It emphasizes that God has set something in place ahead of time, not that he has micromanaged every inward move that will ever occur. The next phrase of the paraphrase makes this explicit, so that they would be influenced by that framework. Here the wording is not a direct rendering of a single Greek word. It is drawing out the logic of the verse in light of the larger flow of Romans 8. Paul compresses a great deal into the simple phrase, sumorphos tes ekonos. The entire chapter around this verse is about how people are actually reshaped, and the picture he gives is not one of bare decree, but one of spirit-mediated influence in a moral environment. In verses 4 through 13, Paul talks about walking according to the Spirit, setting the mind on the things of the Spirit, and putting to death the deeds of the body. These are active, ongoing responses. In Romans as a whole, they become possible because God has acted in Christ, joining believers to his death and resurrection, and placing them under a new lordship. When Paul says this happens by the Spirit, he is not describing a secret inner switch that forces our choices. He is describing the Spirit bringing Christ's work, teaching and example home to us, reshaping our inner life, convicting us about right and wrong, and pressing the truth on our conscience. God works through that truth and through the Spirit's influence, appealing to our minds and hearts, and people really do change in response. So these remain real human actions inside the moral framework God has set up, not automatic movements caused behind our backs. In verses 14 through 17, he describes believers as sons led by the Spirit, crying, Abba, Father, sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Again, the picture is relational and participatory. In verses 18 through 27, he speaks of creation groaning, believers groaning, and the Spirit interceding with inexpressible groans. God is not an abstract force who flips a metaphysical switch inside people. He works through a complex network of influences, invitations, warnings, comforts, and shared suffering. When Romans 8:29 says that those whom God knew beforehand, he also proorison, samorphos tes ekonos, It is summing up that entire pattern in one compact expression. The presetting is not a bare decree floating in space. It is the establishment of a Christ-shaped way of life into which people are called, and within which they are gradually reshaped. To say that God set them within a predefined framework so that they would be influenced by that framework to be conformed is to make explicit what the chapter as a whole assumes. Conformity to Christ does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs as people live inside a spirit-given framework that continually leans on them, forms them, and calls for their intelligent cooperation. Someone might object at this point that such wording sounds a little sociological, more like an environment than an act of God. But that contrast is false. For Paul, the environment itself is one of God's acts. The framework is not a mere set of circumstances he happens to use. It is something he has intentionally designed and set in place. God presets the Christ pattern as the standard and atmosphere of life for those he has already known and loved. That is very different from saying that he simply observes whatever moral or religious culture happens to arise. To speak of a predefined framework in this context is to speak of divine ordering and provision. The last clause of the paraphrase restates Paul's own words more directly: to be conformed to the image of Christ. This is the English equivalent of sumorphos tes eikonos tou huiou. The plural adjective sumorphos carries the idea of sharing a form, being shaped in the same pattern. The image is the Son's image. Translating his Son as Christ here is simply a way of making plain to a non-specialist reader who is in view. The important point is that the goal of the entire action is not an abstract status, but a concrete likeness. Whatever God does in knowing beforehand and presetting, it aims at a certain outcome in character and life, a family likeness that will make the Son firstborn among many brothers, as the second half of the verse says. If we gather these observations, we can see why this paraphrase is a fair and careful representation of Romans 8:29. It honors the timeline of the verbs by speaking of those God knew previously. It honors the boundary-setting sense of proorizo by speaking of setting within a predefined framework rather than speaking as if the verb meant to causally determine every subsequent event. It honors the Christ pattern at the heart of the verse by speaking of the image of Christ as the goal, and it honors the overall movement of the chapter by acknowledging that the conformity occurs as people live under the influence of a framework God has established, and the Spirit actively uses to shape them toward the image of Christ. Equally important, this wording refuses to smuggle in things the text does not say. There is no vocabulary here for inevitability, compulsion, or impersonal fate. Paul does not say that God made it impossible for these people to do otherwise. He says that God knew them as his own, and that on that basis he preset them as people to be shaped according to Christ's image. When we read Romans 8 in sequence, we see that this shaping happens through the Spirit, through suffering, through perseverance, through real choices and responses that matter. The paraphrase holds those threads together. It presents God as the one who designs and initiates the framework, and it presents human conformity to Christ as the intended result of ongoing influence within that framework, rather than as the mechanical outcome of a timeless decree. In this way, the paraphrase functions as a commentary in miniature. It uses contemporary language, but it is anchored in the grammar and in the context. For readers who have been taught to hear predestined as locked in by an invisible fate, this way of stating the verse can open a window. It lets them see that Paul's concern in Romans 8:29 is not to outline a philosophy of determinism, but to assure those who love God and are called according to his purpose that the path they are walking, in all its pain and struggle, is framed by a prior divine intention. God has already set in advance that the path leads toward Christlikeness. The sentence, "those he knew previously," he set within a predefined framework so that they would be influenced by that framework to be conformed to the image of Christ, is simply that assurance, stated in the explanatory style of our own day.